On October 27th of 1962, the world stands on the edge of annihilation. In the Arctic, an American U-2 spy plane strays into Soviet airspace. In Cuba, a Soviet submarine, believing war has begun, prepares to launch a nuclear torpedo. One wrong move, 1 second too late, and World War III erupts. But what if history had played out differently? What if the Cold War turned hot? Would civilization survive, or would this be the end of humanity? Let's explore the terrifying alternate timeline of a nuclear war that almost happened. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest that the world has ever come to nuclear war. The crisis began in October of '62 when American U-2 spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, about 90 miles off the U.S. coast. These missiles, once operational, could strike nearly every major American city in minutes. President John F. Kennedy responded with an airtight naval blockade around Cuba, demanding the immediate removal of the missiles. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev refused to back down, warning that any attack on Cuba would mean war. For 13 days, the world held its breath. The slightest miscalculation, an accidental attack, a misunderstood signal, it could all trigger nuclear Armageddon. The tension climaxed on October 27th, when an American U-2 was shot down over Cuba. The pressure inside the White House was unbearable. Would the U.S. retaliate? Would the Soviets see this as an act of war? What if Kennedy had ordered a strike on Soviet missile sites? What if the Soviets had launched in response? This is where history could have taken a very different and very deadly turn. On the most dangerous day of the Cold War, 3 major flashpoints could have ignited a global war. First, the downing of an American U-2 spy plane over Cuba. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., became the only combat casualty of the crisis. His death put intense pressure on the White House to retaliate. If the U.S. did strike back, the Soviets would have assumed full war had begun and then launched their missiles. Second, in the Arctic, another U-2 mistakenly drifted into Soviet airspace. Soviet MiG fighters scrambled to intercept. The U.S. sent F-102 jets armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles. One itchy trigger finger, and the war could have begun then and there. And the third and most terrifying moment came underwater. The Soviet B-59 submarine, equipped with a nuclear torpedo, was trapped and under attack from U.S. depth charges. The crew, believing war had started, prepared to launch. It took one man, Vasily Arkhipov, to refuse and prevent nuclear catastrophe. But what if he agreed? One launch could have triggered the unthinkable. To have the nuclear torpedo launched, the USS Randolph, a U.S. aircraft carrier, would have been instantly obliterated. Hundreds of American sailors would be dead. The White House would have no choice but to respond. Within minutes, Kennedy's War Council would authorize an all-out strike on Soviet missile sites in Cuba. Thousands of U.S. bombers and naval forces would unleash destruction on the Soviet military in Cuba, killing thousands of Soviet troops stationed there. But the war wouldn't stop in Cuba. The Soviet leadership, now under maximum pressure, would likely retaliate by striking American bases in Turkey, Italy, and Germany. With Soviet missiles already positioned in these regions, the first nuclear detonations would occur over Ankara, Naples, and West Berlin. Now, once that happened, full-scale nuclear war was unstoppable. With nuclear detonations in Europe, NATO and the Warsaw Pact would be drawn into the fight. Soviet tanks would begin a massive invasion of West Germany, facing off against U.S., British, and West German forces. At first, NATO forces might have held off the Soviet advance with conventional forces, but as Soviet numbers overwhelmed them, the U.S. would resort to tactical nuclear weapons. In this alternate timeline, the first nuclear battlefield detonation would likely occur in Fulda, Germany, where Soviet and NATO forces were expected to clash in any European war. A single battlefield nuke could wipe out entire tank divisions, but it would also invite Soviet retaliation. So what happens next? The world plunges into nuclear abyss. Once both sides cross the nuclear threshold, there is no going back. The U.S. and Soviet Union will begin all-out nuclear attacks against each other's military and civilian targets. The first wave would target command centers, nuclear silos, and air bases. In the U.S., the first Soviet nukes would likely strike Washington, D.C. to cripple government leadership, NORAD headquarters to destroy U.S. nuclear defense systems, and strategic air command bases to prevent American bombers from launching. In the Soviet Union, American missiles would target Moscow and Leningrad to eliminate Soviet leadership, Soviet missile sites in Siberia to neutralize nuclear retaliation, and key industrial and military hubs. Within hours, the world will become an inferno, but this is just the first wave. Both superpowers had pre-planned nuclear war strategies. The U.S. had Single Integrated Operational Plan 62, which prioritized a massive first strike to completely cripple the USSR. The Soviets had their own dead-hand retaliation system. If their leadership was wiped out, their nuclear forces would automatically launch every remaining warhead at the U.S. Within minutes, the entire world would be unrecognizable. As the nuclear inferno rages between the U.S. and Soviet Union, the rest of the world, they stand at a crossroads. China, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, finds itself in a precarious position. Initially, China might attempt to remain neutral, exploiting the chaos to expand its influence in Asia. But with fallout drifting across borders and Soviet and American targets close to Chinese territory, neutrality becomes impossible. Non-aligned nations like India, Yugoslavia, and Egypt would grapple with the devastating implications of the superpowers conflict. Would they be forced to pick a side, or would they withstand the political and environmental fallout? In Africa and Latin America, proxy wars would escalate, with local conflicts spiraling into nuclear-backed skirmishes. Nations that had previously distanced themselves from the Cold War would now find themselves caught in the aftermath. As nuclear winter sets in, food shortages and radiation poisoning would sweep across continents, leaving no corner of the globe untouched. In this global conflagration, no nation remains untouched. Now, with thousands of nuclear warheads detonating, the Earth's atmosphere becomes shrouded in a thick, choking cloud of soot and ash. This nuclear winter blocks sunlight, plummeting global temperatures. Crops fail, leading to mass starvation. Radiation from the blasts permeates the air, water, and soil, creating long-term environmental devastation. Survivors face lethal doses of radiation, leading to cancer, birth defects, and a rapidly declining population. The infrastructure of civilization collapses. Without functional governments, desperate survivors turn to looting, violence, and tribal warfare. Technology and industry grind to a halt, plunging humanity into a new dark age. Even nations untouched by the initial blast suffer from radiation sickness, famine, and the collapse of international trade. The global economy crumbles, and once thriving cities are reduced to ghostly ruins. The skies darken, and for the survivors, every breath is a gamble. The earth becomes a graveyard, the sky a constant reminder of human folly. Now, in the aftermath, the remnants of humanity struggle to survive. Without governments, local warlords seize power, ruling over shattered communities with an iron fist. The old world order is gone, replaced by a brutal fight for survival. Cities lie in ruin. New York, Moscow, Beijing, once symbols of human achievement, are now haunted wastelands. Books, art, and knowledge are all lost as the focus shifts solely to basic survival. Food and clean water become the most valuable commodities. With the agriculture system decimated by nuclear winter, survivors scavenge the irradiated landscape for anything edible. Society regresses into barter systems and tribal alliances. The global population, once soaring towards 7 billion, plummets to mere millions. Disease and starvation become the leading causes of death, with epidemics sweeping through refugee camps. The dream of human progress ends in a nightmare of our own making. But what if the Cold War turned hot not in 1962, but the 80s? Now, by this time, nuclear arsenals had quadrupled, and both superpowers had developed advanced second strike capabilities. The 80s saw Ronald Reagan and Leonid Brezhnev overseeing massive military buildups, including the controversial Star Wars missile defense system and the deployment of Pershing II missiles in Europe. A conflict in the 80s would involve far more sophisticated and deadly weaponry. ICBMs with multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs, would blanket continents in destruction. The resulting fallout and EMP blasts would cripple electronic infrastructure globally, thrusting the world into darkness. With satellites destroyed and communication networks disabled, even nations far from the initial conflict would face economic collapse and societal chaos. The world of the 1980s was even closer to the brink, with devastation on an unimaginable scale. Beyond the city-destroying ICBMs, both sides had tactical nuclear weapons, smaller battlefield nukes intended for military targets. Deployed in Western Europe, these weapons could devastate troop concentrations, supply lines, and critical infrastructure. Imagine a battlefield where nuclear artillery shells explode over advancing forces, reducing entire regiments to ash, or nuclear landmines detonate beneath invading tanks, creating radiated wastelands across Europe's heart. The use of tactical nukes would quickly escalate to strategic exchanges, as each side retaliates with more significant and more devastating strikes. The boundaries between battlefield and home front blur, turning every corner of the globe into a potential target. The concept of a limited nuclear war proves itself a dangerous fantasy. Now, even if the initial nuclear exchange decimated the US and Soviet Union, submarines lurking beneath the oceans would launch a second wave. Ballistic missile submarines, or SSBNs, like the American Ohio class and Soviet Typhoon class, carry dozens of nuclear warheads, each capable of obliterating cities. These underwater fortresses can remain hidden for months, ensuring retaliation even if the homeland gets destroyed. Now, as these silent hunters unleash their payloads, cities untouched by the first strikes, San Francisco, Vladivostok, Paris, Tokyo, would all face annihilation. The concept of mutually assured destruction becomes reality, leaving no victor, only mutual ruin. The oceans, once a symbol of life and trade, become harbingers of death and destruction. Now, for those who survive the initial blasts, life becomes a nightmare of radiation, starvation, and lawlessness. Cities are reduced to radioactive rubble, farmlands are poisoned, and water sources contaminated. Radiation sickness claims the weak, while the strong form marauding gangs competing for dwindling resources. Former allies become enemies as the fight for survival turns desperate. Now, families hide in makeshift shelters, rationing canned food and fearing the next raid. Diseases like cholera and typhoid surge as sanitation systems collapse. Children grow up in a world where the sun is obscured by nuclear ash, and hope is a relic of the past. Civilization collapses, and humanity teeters on the edge of extinction. From Berlin to Cuba, the Cold War was marked by near misses and razor-thin margins. Able Archer 83, a NATO exercise, nearly provoked a Soviet first strike. The Berlin Crisis of 1961 saw tanks face off at Checkpoint Charlie. War was averted only by the smallest acts of restraint. These lessons remind us just how fragile peace truly is. The Cold War may have ended, but the nuclear arsenals remain, shadows of a danger that still lurks in silos and submarines worldwide. History is full of moments where catastrophe was narrowly avoided. So what if? Now, today, nuclear powers are no longer just the US and Russia. China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, each brings its own volatile dynamics to the table. Could a new Cold War erupt in Asia or the Middle East? Could cyber warfare or artificial intelligence trigger unintended conflicts? The danger of nuclear war remains as real today as it was in 1962. How close are we to repeating the mistakes of the past? Well, the Cold War may have ended, but its lessons remain vital. As we stand on the brink of new challenges, we must ask ourselves, have we truly learned from history? If we don't understand the fragility of peace, we risk repeating the same fatal mistakes. Let's work toward a future where mutual destruction is no longer a possibility, but a relic of history. What are your thoughts? How close do you think we are to another crisis? Let's continue the conversation and make sure history never repeats itself.